All right, hello everybody. Welcome back to this next portion of the video where we're just kind of focusing on the actual brain itself. So we'll go ahead and get started here. Taking a look at this guy. Don't want the pen, want the laser pointer. Perfect. Okay, so in general, we have three different sections of our brain. We have the brain stem, we're going to have the cerebellum, and then we're going to have the cerebrum. And as we work our way from inferior to superior, we'll kind of see that we gain higher functioning abilities. Down here at the brain stem, we're just going to be primarily focused on keeping the body alive. And then as we work our way up to the cerebellum and the cerebrum, we start to notice a kind of trend where we get more complicated functions as we work our way up. So, first up, taking a look at the brainstem. The part of the brainstem that is in direct contact with our spinal cord, a direct continuation of it, is known as the medulla oblongata. So the medulla oblongata is an autonomic center for regulation of, cardiovascular, respiratory, and digestive system activities. This is also a location where a lot of our cranial nerves are kind of getting sprouted from. And something cranial nerves is something we'll be talking about the week we come back. So that should be pretty fun. Talking about all those guys. Directly above the medulla oblongata is known as the pons. This is also going to be an area for basically relay sensory information as well as subconscious, somatic, and visceral motor centers. So, um, collectively, as long as you understand that the brainstem is primarily focused on keeping the body alive, keeping it functioning, you guys will be all right for the quiz and for the exam. As for the midbrain, we'll kind of skip the midbrain for now. We'll come back to that in just a little bit. For the cerebellum is going to coordinate complex somatic motor patterns and adjust a few other outputs. In general, if I had to break down cerebellum and explain it in an even simpler way, this is pretty much your muscle memory. So for those of you who commute to college, if you're driving to school, driving back from school, you're not entirely conscious of the drive the entire time. You're obviously aware if like an accident happens or something like that, but your brain tends to wander, and you kind of leave it for your muscle memory to be in control instead. This is primarily where the cerebellum shines. This is where like a lot of his functioning kind of does. The cerebellum is also kind of active if you've ever played video games and you are not paying attention to the controller, you're just kind of moving, pressing the buttons around. Or if you're taking notes on your laptop, you're not actively looking at the keys. Your cerebellum's kind of using that motor memory to kind of act instead. Cerebellum is also kind of capable in helping out with various levels of speech as well. So that's kind of interesting when we think about alcohol and how alcohol affects the body. When alcohol is entering our system, the first place that it kind of like targets is the cerebellum. So it kind of explains why somebody who's drunk would have slurred speech as well as like poor hand-eye coordination, is because the cerebellum is like the first place to kind of get hit with this. For the thalamus and the hypothalamus, they are part of a region of the brain known as the diencephalon. So encephalon just refers to brain, di refers to half. So the reason I call it the half brain is because when we cut this brain in half, that's when we'll be able to see it. We never really see a portion of the brain kind of like this, quite like this. So for the diencephalon, we have two different regions. We have the thalamus and we have the hypothalamus. The thalamus in general is a relay and processing center for sensory information, very specific sensory information. So imagine all these neurons are like trains. You have a lot of trains kind of passing through, but you have a central train station that all of these trains need to communicate with. That's what your thalamus is doing, and he kind of directs various sensory input to different parts of your brain that would need that information the most or would interpret it best. Your thalamus is also actually bypassed by one sensory information. I just want you guys to be aware of this kind of like oddball is your sense of smell. Your sense of smell is actually not processed by the thalamus. That's the only one that's kind of unique. Your hypothalamus, hypo referring to below, is just the region below your thalamus. Your hypothalamus is essentially a region for controlling emotions and hormone production. So for hormone production, this is a big topic when we talk about in 211 and 202. It's the first thing you guys talk about is the endocrine system. So your hypothalamus produces a lot of the hormones that are kind of involved in bodily functions overall. If you want a general idea idea of a breakdown of what the hypothalamus is in charge of, if you remember these four F's, there's fighting, flighting, feeding, and sexual reproduction. And that's kind of what the hypothalamus is in charge of, those four F's right there. Next up, we have the cerebrum. So the cerebrum is going to take a little bit longer to break down because this is pretty much where all higher functioning occurs. So we'll kind of skip this guy just for now. Let's see. We talked about thalamus, hypothalamus, pineal body. Um, we actually do have to talk about that guy. It should be a better image right here. Perfect. So the pineal body or the pineal gland is found on the dorsal side or most posterior side of the brain. This guy is actually what is going to secrete melatonin. Melatonin is actually what puts you to sleep, essentially. Your pineal gland is actually has a lot of communication with your optic nerve. So as your body kind of interprets light as there's less light overall. Your body's like, okay, let's start producing melatonin. Let's get ready for bed. Let's start falling asleep. Now we also have the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum is kind of enraging this entire area right here. Corpus callosum is allowing for communication between your left and right hemispheres of the brain. So this guy's going to be basically allowing for that communication to exist between those two. Septum pellucidum, so septum refers to wall. So septum pellucidum is actually going to be a wall that divides our lateral ventricles. So we'll come back and talk about the lateral ventricles in just a minute. This is essentially what a cadaver brain is going to kind of look like. So be sure you guys kind of like study this image well for test day. Here we have our thalamus region in front of the pineal gland. Hypothalamus is the region below the pineal gland, or below the thalamus, sorry. And connected to the hypothalamus, we actually have something known as the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is this small little gland that sits inside of your sella turcica. Unfortunately, it is just about always disconnected on the cadaver brains because it's actually very hard to kind of pull out of the sella turcica. So as long as you're aware of the pituitary gland, that's about it. I can't really ask you to identify it on the cadaver, unfortunately. Um, let's see. Okay, we'll kind of move on. Mesencephalon. So this is the midbrain that I kind of mentioned earlier. We have a superior and an inferior colliculi. So with regards to superior and inferior colliculi, these are primarily based on reflexes. What kind of reflexes, you might be asking? Our superior colliculi is actually going to be a pair that's based on auditory reflex, and the inferior colliculi is going to be based primarily on visual reflex. So imagine you're sitting in a classroom really focused on attention of the teacher, like you should be, and somebody opens up a door. You see the entire class, all heads turn towards the door, right? That's kind of an evolutionary instinct to, watch out for danger. And that's what these superior and inferior colliculi are kind of primarily there for, is to pull your attention towards something that's very sudden, that requires a reflex and not really conscious thought instead. For this next part, this is just the cerebellum. The only other part that you need to identify for the cerebellum is the arbor vitae. So we break up that word. Arbor refers to tree, vitae refers to life. So this is just a tree of life found inside of the arbor vitae. Inside of the cerebellum. As long as you guys are aware of identifying this, you should be fine. Kind of keep going. All right, so the telencephalon itself, or the actual brain. Um, let's just kind of jump right into it. So, frontal lobe. Frontal lobe is directly behind the frontal bone of the skull. Kind of makes sense, right? The frontal lobe is in charge of primarily executive functioning. So, anything that you decide to do, any decision that you make, will be part of your frontal lobe. If you want to move your leg, if you wanted to kick your leg right now, that thought occurred in the frontal lobe, and that thought was committed in the frontal lobe. If you decide to make plans in the future, it's also going to be frontal lobe, primarily there for your taking. Um, what's actually kind of cool in like the neuropsychology realm is that a lot of the personality disorders, clusters A, B, and C of the weird, wild, worried, like OCD, all that kind of stuff, they actually found like differences in the frontal lobe region, which is pretty cool, at least in my opinion. Back here we have the parietal lobe covered by the parietal bones. The parietal lobe is primarily going to be where all sensory input is understood. Pretty much everything besides your sense of vision. Your sense of vision is going to be solely occupied in the occipital lobe, behind the occipital bone. Your occipital lobe is just vision. That's all you really need to know about it. Parietal lobe is interpretation of all sensory input. So if you are grabbing onto your wrist right now, that feeling that you would get would be in the parietal lobe, interpreted there. Then we have the temporal lobe. Your temporal lobe is a little bit more of a miscellaneous lobe. Anything that we haven't talked about, like emotion, memory, auditory interpretation, all of that is kind of going into the temporal lobe. And the temporal lobe is going to be primarily focused on understanding all of that. We also have two other areas of Wernicke's area, approximately right here, and Broca's area, going to be further up. I'm not going to cover them too much because those are pretty much going to be focused on in lecture, but just as a way to reinforce some of your information, Wernicke's area is an understanding of what you are saying, and Broca's area is basically like the decision to say something. Let's kind of keep on going. The cerebral hemispheres, we have a left and a right cerebral hemispheres that I kind of mentioned earlier. They are divided by what is known as the longitudinal fissures. So longitudinal fissures are going to run atop the brain, and it's going to split the brain into the left and right side, only connected through the corpus callosum. Cerebral cortex is just referring to the entire cerebrum here. Gyri and sulci, those are just some small features of the brain that we can see here, all of these foldings. So the individual grooves that we see kind of coming along here are the sulci, and then the actual folds themselves of the brain matter is the gyri. So pretty much the purpose of these two guys right here is to increase surface area to allow for the brain to basically like get more neurons in a smaller area to allow for all of this executive functioning, all this information interpretation, and all this decision making stuff. Now, we also have a central sulcus. So the central sulcus is what's going to be dividing our frontal lobe and our parietal lobe. The central sulcus is also going to be allow us to point out the precentral and postcentral gyrus. These guys actually have alternative names that I hope you guys are going to know for quiz day. Precentral gyrus is also referred to as the somatomotor cortex. So you can remember motor because frontal lobe is in charge of the executive function for all of our motor functioning. The somatomotor cortex is pretty much where a lot of the focus is for the frontal lobe. The postcentral gyrus is also known as the somatosensory cortex, and that's going to be where a lot of the interpretation of sensation is going to. We also have the lateral fissure. The lateral fissure is also known as the lateral sulcus. This is going to divide the temporal lobe from the frontal and parietal lobes. Corpus callosum, that just connects the two parts of the brain. And we'll come back to the ventricles in just a second. Here we can see a real brain. Oh, whoops. Here we can see the longitudinal fissure that I mentioned. On a brain model like this, you can kind of see the arbor vitae back here, corpus callosum, thalamus, hypothalamus. Number 23 right here would be the pineal gland. And then 31 is actually showing the superior and inferior colliculi. We have the pons, medulla oblongata down here. This is kind of referred to as the superior olive, but that's more for localizing sound. We don't have to cover that too much. All right, so for the ventricles. Now, we talked a little bit about the choroid plexus and the ependymal cells that create the cerebral spinal fluid. That cerebral spinal fluid is actually now going to be distributed throughout these various ventricles. So, starting the circuit, we're actually going to be starting in what is known as the lateral ventricles. The lateral ventricles are going to be found most superiorly, and they're going to be divided by the septum pellucidum, the one that we saw earlier. The lateral ventricles are going to drain their cerebral spinal fluid into the interventricular foramen. The interventricular foramen is going to kind of gather all of it up and send it into what is known as the third ventricle. The third ventricle is then going to travel through the cerebral aqueduct into the fourth ventricle, and then that's going to kind of go down the central canal. And remember, this is all taking place in the subarachnoid space. Back here, we can actually see this small little passageway that I'm following with my laser is actually going to be the cerebral aqueduct that travels down to the fourth ventricle, and then eventually into the central canal. And that looks like it's pretty much it. Thank you guys for watching.